Welcome everyone to this extended session of Q&A following our webinar on the 13th of April on DNACPR. And that was obviously a really important topic. We've had a record number of registrations on that webinar, lots of views on YouTube. And we thought we'd extend the Q&A session because there were so many questions on the Q&A. And we didn't really have time to really go into the issues properly. So today we've invited the speakers back, and we've also invited some of the attendees who posed really important questions in the Q&A box. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Kathryn Mannix, Dr. Claud Regnard, Baroness Ilora Finlay, and Muireann Ní Riain, who were the speakers at our webinar. We've also got here Gina Walker and Ian Penfold, who are both family carers who asked us some really important questions. Kathryn, I may well start with you because there were a lot of questions around your explanation that sometimes a do not resuscitate order is put on simply because doctors know it won't work. It's not a treatment that's going to be effective. The other reason to put it up on DNACPR is, of course, it might work, you don't know, it might work, and therefore it needs to be an best interest decision to see whether the family and the person and everybody around and the doctors think this is a good idea to try or not. Those are the two different reasons for DNACPR. And I will come on to our first questioner in a moment, but I wonder whether you could just expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, thanks, Irene. So I think maybe it's helpful to start by saying that this conversation would be the same thing that I would say if I wasn't talking about people as patients who happen also to have a learning disability. This is about medical decision making, and their learning disability should in fact have no role to play in whether or not they are well enough. So the question is this person able to, is this person's body able to survive if their heart stops? And the answer to that is either no, because in fact their systems are already so broken, they are so sick, they've been so damaged by whatever has happened to them that we can't do CPR and we can't restart their heart. In which case that's a medical decision, and we have to give that advice to the person and to their family. And it's a really, really sorrowful conversation to have with somebody, but it's really important that people know. But if the answer is yes, they could, then a person with capacity will say, look, you're really sick, things are pretty bad here. If your heart were to stop, there's this thing, cardiopulmonary resuscitation is a first aid measure that might keep you going long enough to restore you to being still really sick, but possibly able to be saved. Would you like us to do that or not? And they have that choice. So
can I just, that's helpful. I think I'll just bring Ian Penfold in here, because Ian, this is exactly what you had worries and concerns about. Would you be able to explain a little bit what your questions are around that?
Thank you, Irene. First thing, to cover the DNACPR, I just want to say first of all that we're being told that CPR has a fairly low rate of success. And for this reason, it's becoming more infrequent. We're told that the procedure can cause additional distress and physical damage, which is not in the patient's best interests. Yet, if we don't try, we don't know if it will save a life. But however, if we try and then succeed, the patient may live, albeit with some physical damage, which I would argue is justifiable if their life is saved.
Thank you very much. So your question, that really important question you asked, do you have sort of experience of that, and where does your concern come from? Because it sounds as if as if you're speaking from experience.
My wife and son has a learning disability, so I've been involved with learning disability for something like 4 decades now, through her, and he's 30. My son's 32 now and has extremely complex needs. And has been into hospital about 7 times in the last 6 months. So this kind of, what we're talking about is very close personally to me, as well as actually supporting other people. So working with families with sons and daughters learning disabilities. Some have had dreadful experiences in life and at the end of life. And I've also I was the patient rep on the Wessex steering group for Leader from start to finish. And I do often see cases where the family has not been consulted. And I don't actually, whilst there is a medical rationale for this, I don't understand how a clinician can ultimately be able to make the final decision without actually consulting the family.
Thank you, Ian. So it is really a concern, if I understand rightly, around about doctors making decisions without consulting, without talking to the families. And how can doctors be so sure that it's not going to work? And a concern that those decisions are sometimes made when in fact it might work. Yeah. Ilora, I wonder whether you could say something about this.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you, Ian. I think for a start, the law is actually quite clear now that these decisions should involve the person themselves if they can have that conversation. So taking, as Kathryn explained, if so many systems in the body are already closing down and closed down, and that looks like that is irreversible, you can do as much external cardiac massage as you like, and you can put enough electric shocks over, but that person is not going to be restored in any sense at all because they are dying. This is an irreversible part at the end of their life. But you, as a clinician, should still have a conversation with them, firstly, about what do they want, and not just focusing on CPR, but what do they want in general? Are you meeting their needs in terms of who's with them and so on? If a person has impaired capacity, you need to ask yourself, do they have the capacity for that conversation? And you must adjust the conversation to meet their needs and understanding. And it is only when you've done that that you can then, in fact, make a decision. And if you're going to decide that you're going to withhold attempting cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which is what do not attempt CPR means, then if the person has capacity, they should know that that's being written down. And if they don't have capacity, then that decision will be being taken because it would be futile to attempt it, but their family and those who are close to them need to know. So there must be open conversations, and I think the problems that have arisen have where they've either not been clear, open, honest conversations about what's happening and about prognosis, or where there actually hasn't been a careful assessment, or even worse, where the family feel that they're being asked to take the decision, and they can feel as if they're being asked to sign somebody's life away, which is a terrible burden to put on them, particularly if they are overwhelmingly distressed by the fact that the person is dying anyway.
And I wonder whether there's also something around concerns that sometimes doctors make these decisions without really being sure that it won't work, and for the wrong reasons. I'm going to bring in Gina here.
I was wondering where the best interest meeting actually comes in. If it comes in, if like I'm a parent carer to a 23-year-old, I haven't got power of attorney or deputyship for that young man, but would there be a best interest meeting surrounding this beforehand, before it got to a critical condition? And I think it's also about having a healthy death. So it's about training parent carers, if you like, how to get something in place beforehand, before it comes to the urgent emergency treatment. If they've got a long-standing illness, for instance, if they've got terminal cancer or something like that. So, but I agree with Ian totally, but I just think it's about best interest as well, not just would they talk to people about best interest rather than only if they've got power of attorney in my situation.
Claude, I wonder whether you can sort of come in here and talk a little bit about best interest.
I mean, I just wanted to answer something that Ian mentioned, which I think is really quite important, about the success rate of CPR. Now, as Kathryn quite rightly says, there are a lot of situations where the success rate is 0, and there's no doubt it's not a judgment. It's unquestionably 0, and that depends on the circumstances. But at the opposite end of the scale, and I'm thinking in particular of children and young people with neurodegenerative disease who have repeated seizures and often go into respiratory arrest, the success rate of CPR, because CPR, the R is respiration, the success rate is close to 100%. And it's everything in between. In other words, the real success range is between 0 and 100%. It depends entirely on the circumstances. Now, one of the difficulties, and you've mentioned this best interests. Now, the problem with the phrase is that it is probably the most abused phrase in clinical care, in that many healthcare professionals, say, and sometimes families say, I think it is or it isn't in this person's best interests. Now, best interests is actually, it's not a process. Lawyers would argue that it's not a process. They probably argue it's not a checklist either. But nevertheless, there are some requirements in England and Wales, and there are a minimum of 8 required in England and Wales under the Mental Capacity Act that you're supposed to go through. And in 2 of those, it requires you to document that you haven't made assumptions about the quality of life. So a best interest meeting is actually a clear process that not only has to be gone through, but also documented. If you don't document it, a court of law says, well, you never did it. Now, one of the odd things, and I'll come back to best interest, but one of the odd things is that right across the board with regards to CPR, and in fact many other treatments, there is an assumption to treat. There is an assumption that you should do CPR. So why doesn't that happen with people with learning disability and complex disabilities? Why is that assumption not there? Because that's the assumption we should be starting from. You have somebody with learning disability, unless the success rate, and you're certain, is 0, then there is a possibility it might succeed. Never mind what you think might happen later or what the consequences may be. There has to be an assumption that you have to consider it. And then you work backwards and say, are there reasons why we shouldn't do this? And that is the best interest meeting. And that requires one of the issues in best, and it's a requirement by law. This is not guidance. It's not best practice. It's a requirement by the law that you have to consult others. And by others, they mean people who know the individual. Now, it doesn't mean to say that those others have to make the decision, but it does say that you have to include them in that process. You also have to include the person with a learning disability as well, unless they're unable to take part. But if they're able to take part, even if they, and obviously you only have best interest if they lack capacity, but even if they lack capacity, their opinion still has to be taken into account. So that consulting of others is really quite crucial. So there is actually a requirement if somebody lacks capacity. Now, if somebody has capacity, there is not a requirement to include others. And in fact, the person who has capacity can make the decision to the exclusion and perhaps against what other people, their opinions might be. And that's quite a challenge sometimes when an individual with capacity is making a decision that family feel isn't the right decision. And that is a challenge, and that has to be worked through. But certainly a person with capacity has the right to make that decision. If they lack capacity and they've been shown to that, it's a best interest process.
Okay. Let me then also now bring, because I can see Muireann, you've had your hand up. And Muireann, you explained in the webinar, you told a story of some of your experiences. You're a learning disability liaison nurse, in Ireland.
Yes, yeah, and I suppose, I mean, one of the challenges, I mean, our legislative piece is slightly different, and we're moving towards assisted decision making in Ireland and that. But from a practical point of view, as a acute hospital liaison nurse working for a service for people with intellectual disabilities, I've had the honour, I suppose, and the challenge to have to be involved in some of these conversations with families and also with the person with intellectual disabilities. And as I was through the webinar, I explained some of the more challenging ones, which, as Ian was talking about, it's that inclusion of people in the decision making, and involvement of the person themselves. That was where we really were frustrated when things didn't go to you know, that they didn't include the person or the people that knew them best in the decision making. And then also, I suppose it wasn't always that we didn't necessarily disagree, because I suppose the DNO around that do not actively resuscitate is such a first aid, as Kathryn was saying, that it wouldn't necessarily improve somebody's quality of life, and a lot of the people that I work with in the long term. But it's that it needs to be open to them. It is assumed that they are, and unfortunately we had a few situations where we weren't told or weren't involved in the decision in the last year or so. But thankfully we have had it where the doctors would have come to us first, to me and the family, or that, and then we redirect them to the person. But they didn't feel that they were, you know, so we would have supported them in communicating with the person. So we discussed with the doctors about maybe myself or somebody belonging to the person to explain what the decision was. And that way the person was involved in the decision. I've been very lucky to have, you know, kind of really positive stories as well. But I suppose it is around that open communication and involvement. And the frustration really is when you're not involved. That one situation with that, you know, I mean, I've been 3.5 years in my role. And so if there's 2 or 3 year situations that I have been very frustrated by it, but I also could count on 2 hands, thankfully, the really positive, involved, inclusive ways of making these decisions.
Thanks, Muireann. Thank you very much. Ian, I can see your hand is up.
I just wanted to broaden it a little bit, if you would excuse me, to say that we all know people with learning disabilities make significant challenges and disadvantages during their lifetimes, including how they're sometimes viewed by others. And this can include things like a lack of understanding, apathy, sometimes discrimination by society. Their rights and lives may not be regarded as important. They may be perceived as having a lower quality of life, and sometimes have huge difficulties in obtaining their essential support that they require. And my question is, how can we be certain that all this doesn't influence decision making by professionals and others actually at the end of these people's lives?
That's a really important question, Ian. And I see that Ilora's got her hand up, so I'm going to go to her. But if she doesn't pick this particular question up, I will come back to it, because that is really important. How can we be sure that people are not discriminated against because of unconscious bias or assumptions about their quality of life? That's really important. Ilora.
I think, Ian, you've highlighted something incredibly important. Sadly, there does seem to be a drop-off in active decision-making if people have got a DNACPR form completed. There is a tendency to view them as inevitably dying, and for the hunt for reversible conditions to be perhaps a little bit less vigorous. So I think that your concerns are completely justified. The other thing that worries me is when we talk about best interest decision making, and you raised it, as Claude rightly said, you must try to think and do all you can to find out what would this person have wanted, and try to put yourself in the shoes of that person. Do not attempt CPR is only about that decision. It does not mean that you abandon all other attempts to look for reversible things which can improve quality of life. But I think, unfortunately, some of those value judgments can creep into people's thinking, and they think, oh, well, they're dying anyway. and we wouldn't perhaps even out, well, you know, we wouldn't want to take blood off them, but they might have a reversible metabolic condition there. It may be something that's quite treatable. So it's a difficult decision all the time as to how active you're going to be.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that is just probably the core of all these discussions. Is, I mean, there are clearly situations, as Kathryn described, when the DNACPR is an utterly appropriate medical decision, right? And maybe should be explained as such. But there are, I mean, we know who have been around people with learning disabilities, particularly you know, the parents, your families, you know better than anyone, that assumptions are made, that people are given, you know, treatments are withheld for the wrong reasons. And we, you know, just looking at some of the leader reports that were in the last annual report, where it said how many people had Down syndrome listed as the reason for the DNACPR order. Clearly, that is outrageously wrong, because that is not something you die of. You know, that is not an irreversible condition, Down syndrome, that you die of. So that is, I suppose, it's all around communication, isn't it? It's both families and the medical team being confident and trusting each other to make decisions for the right reasons. And that just needs, maybe for people with a learning disability more than for the general population, such sensitive and extensive conversations, really, because, I mean, Gina and Ian, you will know better than anyone how often those conversations don't happen and families are not included. So I don't quite know what to suggest in terms of how, you know, how to make sure this is improved. Claude, help us out here.
I mean, one of the problems is that we're dealing with a form or an advisory note, because it's not a legal document. We're dealing with an advisory note that only allows one decision to be documented. That is, not to have CPR. That's the only thing it can do. And that's been recognised a number of years ago as a fundamental problem. And there's now a shift to be saying, actually, we need to be documenting not just that somebody isn't for CPR, but perhaps that they are for CPR, or indeed that there might be other treatments that they should have, even if they're not for CPR. And one of the forms that's now heading towards 75% of the UK is called the Respect form, and that allows you to put both not for resuscitation or not for DNACPR and not for CPR, but also for CPR, and also allows you to put other things like, but actually we want, you know, I want antibiotics, I want to be admitted to hospital, or whatever it is. And so one of the problems we've had is this single decision form, and I think there's a recognition that that is a fundamental problem. And in a way, you have to understand some of the history about why that developed, because 10, 15, 20 years ago and beyond that, one of the big problems was inappropriate CPR. People who were dying where the success rate was going to be 0, people were jumping up and down on their chest trying to resuscitate them. And that was clearly inappropriate and was wrong. And it grew out of that. And Ian is quite right. That level of inappropriate CPR has been dropping over the last decade. But what's been missed, and this is why we're here, is that the level of inappropriate do not resuscitate orders has been climbing, and or at least we're now seeing these. So Respect form is an attempt to try and rebalance that. Whether it'll succeed in time, but at least it will also end up with a single form across the whole of the country, which would be a great advantage. There have been 20, 30, 40, 50 different forms around the country up until now. So it is changing.
Thanks, Claude, and I'm glad you picked it up, because we were hoping in the webinar to have some time to talk about these Respect forms. I don't know how many people have heard of those, so but I am picking up one question that came in the Q&A box written down during the webinar, which is, how can Respect help protect patients with learning disabilities from inappropriate DNACPR orders? We use them in our trust, but they seem to confuse medics further. and learning disability remains listed as a reason for lowering the ceiling of care and implementing DNACPR. So could you just explain a little bit more briefly about what these respect forms are? Because I think a lot of people will have heard of DNACPR and not have heard of respect.
Yeah, and if you ever hear someone talking about a ceiling of care, if you think about it, it's not morally or ethically possible to put a ceiling on the amount of care you provide, but it's a phrase that's often used, but that actually makes no sense whatsoever. But respect isn't just about a form. Respect is about a process that we've already been talking about, a process of communication, a process of consultation that is within the law and complies with the law. So if they have capacity, you ask the individual. If they don't, it's a correct best interest process that is documented. So the respect process, and in fact the website is called respectprocess.org.uk, is because it's about a process, and there's a recognition that a form by itself, and Wales, who although had done some tremendous work with DNACPR, much of their work has actually been around the discussion and communication, and that's where a lot of the success has been. There's no doubt that that's a bigger bit than the form itself. You end up having to have a form because in an emergency you need something you can look at and go, okay, what do I do right now? I don't know this individual, I'm a paramedic, I'm an emergency doctor, I've just come in and they're collapsed. You know, I need to have some immediate advice. So there is something about having a recognizable form, but the process leading to that form is crucial, and we've been talking about that. Now, the fact that it doesn't always happen is not a separate problem, but I think it is a problem we need to be addressing. And there is a sadness in a way, because Kathryn will remember 20-30 years ago, communication was a big thing. You know, it was all about communication and communicating with patients, and somehow we've now ended up with all sorts of phrases like advanced care planning and this, that and the other. It's still about communication, and what's more, there's a fundamental requirement in law that we must communicate under the Mental Capacity Act, and sometimes we have to give a carrot to healthcare professionals to say, look, if you communicate, you're going to end up with fewer problems in the future. The stick is that actually if you don't do this, you're breaking the law.
Thanks, Claude. And Gina, you've got still your hand up again, or have you still got your hand up? Have you got
I've had my hand up again ages, but never mind. I was just going to say, my son got a DNR. They wanted to put a DNR on him when he was 1 year old, and he's 23 this year. And I just think a lot of it is about the training, not only for the professionals, which obviously need this training about learning disability and what have you. I think training for families is crucial, about, you know, the advanced directives, everything that they need for their children, young people, family members. I think it's lacking on both sides, and I believe training is key for this subject for everybody, and I think it really needs addressing. And also, I was just going to say, the best interest meetings that you're talking about, I have a best interest for my son to go see a dentist, but then it seems that families I've spoken to have had these DNRs slapped on their young people's files with no communication, no conversation, no nothing. And I'm just wondering how it can still be happening if you have to have a best interest meeting just for the dentist. Yeah. I don't understand how it's still happening.
Gina, I'm quite shocked to hear that your son had a DNACPR from the age of 1 and he's now 23. Can you explain a little bit more about why or how? Or?
Well, so my son had an undiagnosed epilepsy, so he's having 100 seizures every day. Healthy otherwise, apart from these seizures. Obviously, he wasn't reaching his milestones or anything like that. So they just decided that we need a DNR putting on him because there's no hope for him. But obviously, I mean, he still has numerous seizures every day, maybe up to about 10 at the minute. He's had interventions, but he's got the best social life. I mean, he does all sorts. He goes abroad, he goes on cruises. He can't talk, he can't do anything for himself. He's doubly incontinent. So that's another thing that worries me, that because he's got such complex health needs, in black and white on paper, if someone saw this in the emergency department, would they then think, oh, well, this young person's got no quality of life, so we won't really try very hard. And that really, really scares me. And other parents I spoke to feel exactly the same way, that their children on paper, in the medical terms that's wrong with them, they've got no life, you know, they're having all the needs met, but they've actually got fantastic lives and they're big contributors to the community. And that's my biggest despair about all this subject, is that on black and white, they maybe don't amount to much to some people, but they really have got valuable lives that need to be lived.
Thank you for sharing that, and that is really important to hear. Kathryn, do you want to speak to that?
Gina, thanks for describing that, and I'm speechless at the awfulness that you're living through, and I understand your fears and the fears of so many parents and people who love people who are living with complex physical disabilities, learning disabilities, and a combination of both those things, because decisions in an emergency room need to be made very, very quickly, and often there isn't time to talk, often there isn't time to get additional information. And that's why the thing that Claude is talking about the presumption to work towards the saving of a life, has to be the presumption for every person. And a person with a learning disability is a person and has, in my view, exactly that right in the same way as another person might. My experience as a family of somebody with complex disabilities is of having a very much beloved cousin who had complex physical and learning disabilities, and who, because of her complex heart condition, would not have been resuscitatable should her heart have stopped. So she would have been a person who would have had instructions, if this person ever has, you know, a critical illness that leads to a cardiac arrest, get her mum and dad into the room, find her brothers and sisters, put the right radio station on, let her dying moments be filled with the comfort of all the right things, not a resuscitation team. And so she had a long-standing agreement that CPR wouldn't be part of her care, but lots of other things that nobody could guess would be part of her care. And it comes back to actually understanding that communication is about listening, isn't it? We're talking about it as though it's doctors saying stuff for families to respond to. And actually, we're starting in the wrong place there. Communication is about medical people listening to people who are in our care and the people who know them best, who are able to represent their views and the things that are most important to them, so that then when we have a crisis, we know who to call. You've already met us maybe, and the things that we do are the things that are aligned around what will help that person most and harm that person least. And I can't answer that. The best doctor in the world can't answer that. That's about listening to the wisdom of the people who know that person best.
Thank you, Kathryn, because that is, I think, also where unconscious bias comes in for doctors, you know, because, you know, no doctor, no nurse has bad intentions, and, you know, everybody actually has the same intention, which is the best for this person and really the best possible care. I just sometimes worry that doctors and nurses who are not familiar with learning disability, and particularly with severe and profound learning disability, may think, actually, isn't it kinder that to think it's the best for that person, you know, that is the kind thing, not to put something so traumatizing. And that is, as you say, that just needs so much communication and really understanding, because I think there is we know, we've heard from stories, and you both confirm that, Ian and Gina, that, you know, that it is possible for doctors to actually make those assumptions unconsciously. It's unconscious bias, they won't be aware of it. I think it's the nicest and the kindest thing, but that is quite a difficult one to navigate, isn't it? I'm going to, Ian, I'm going to bring you in because your hand is up, I see.
I'm so grateful to Gina for raising her own personal experience there, you know, because you know, not that I've had, you know, significant kind of near death, if you like, experiences. However, I have sat in the next room when the hospital called the crash team into my son, so I know what that feels like. Now, generally, I want to say that not we personally, but we generally sometimes have a difficulty even getting a communication passport read by professionals who maybe leave it to the side of the desk or put it away in a filing cabinet instead of actually doing what it says on the tin. Never mind doing some of the things that we're talking about today. And I'm not doubting any of you wonderful people in this call, but the system unfortunately does let us down. I'll give you some examples, and one you mentioned earlier, Irene. As a result of the mortality review, of course, they've had ongoing concerns about this during COVID and before, actually. And the CQC and British Institute of Human Rights has also raised concerns about it. 3 bullet points. The first one, as you mentioned, learning disability or Down syndrome should never be a reason for issuing DNACPR orders, or to describe the underlying the only cause of death. Learning disabilities are not fatal conditions, neither is Down syndrome. However, as my experience with the leader team would demonstrate, actually that was happening quite regularly. Second thing is, and this is to do with COVID, that we've had blanket DNACPR notices issued for some groups of patients, including those with learning disabilities, that has resulted in NHS issuing strong guidance that this shouldn't happen. And also the clinical frailty scale was even used wrongly for people with learning disabilities to suggest that they were in the frail category and not likely to warrant or benefit from further treatment. How can those with learning disabilities and their families have confidence in this system that end-of-life care will give them the care and respect that they have a right to expect?
Thank you, Ian. Ilora, I'm going to bring you in. We're talking about how can we be confident in the system. And I think we are all on the same page here, hopefully, that we all genuinely sort of want to do the best and make decisions for the right reasons. But how can we be confident system-wide that happens up and down the country?
I think there are a couple of things there. Just to be clear, the stuff around blanket DNACPR orders across one group in the population was not borne out by the CQC inquiry, if I'm remembering correctly. There was no central government suggestion of any sort. Now, I'm not saying that all decision-making processes are good, because they clearly aren't. But I think that there is a need for much greater working together and communication both ways, and thinking ahead of time. So just as the onus is to think about looking ahead, as Claude has outlined, with what would be appropriate to do, what might this person want, and so on with care planning, there's also a need within a family to talk openly about some of these issues long before the crisis arises, so that they're also clear about what they think needs to be communicated about their family member. Now, if the person is an adult, there is a question as to whether they have a lasting power of attorney for health and welfare decisions, because the person with impaired capacity may have had capacity to appoint someone with an LPA, or it may be that they're a court-appointed deputy, in which case that they will have the responsibilities as laid out by the Court of Protection. But again, we're back to the situation that would apply to anybody. There being a so-called next of kin, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't hold up, it has no status in law. So you basically, the person themselves makes their decision, and if they can't make it, then somebody has to first of all do all they can to support them to make that decision. And if they can't make a decision with support, and they don't have capacity for that decision at that time, then somebody else has to take that over, and that may be the lasting power of attorney or the court-appointed deputy, or if those are not in place, then it would default over a CPR decision to the clinical team. And I think that the improvements will come about by better open forward thinking and forward communication. So that the onus is on everybody, actually. I don't think anyone should underestimate how worn down and exhausted clinical services are at the moment. And they just don't have any room to take on any more. And I think that's important to remember too. So it's very easy to be critical. Perhaps we need to remember the number of times that they have taken good decisions. They've done all they can to support families and people. They've done all they can to facilitate somebody being with somebody who's desperately ill and had to be admitted because of COVID. And I'm putting in a bit of a plea for us to take a more rounded view.
Thanks, Ilora. Claude?
For those who are 16 and above, if you get a situation where people have not been consulted and people have not done a proper best interest, then the healthcare professionals are in breach of the law. There's no argument about it. And there is an argument for saying, should we be informing carers much more about these requirements in England and Wales, certainly, because they need to be empowered with those requirements and say, hang on a second, it's no good saying you've made the decision. You haven't involved us at all. And this is a requirement. You have to do this.
Thanks, Claude. Actually, I'm going to go to you, Gemma, because Gemma Allen is the chair of the PCPLD network and has been sort of behind the scenes in all these webinars and Q&As. Any thoughts and comments? Because you haven't had a chance to say anything, but I know that we thought a lot about this topic.
Yeah, and I think for me, it was really picking up on Gina and Ian's stories and experiences, and about what Gina said about the communication and the training for family members. When you think about end-of-life care, when you think about advanced care planning, everybody needs to be aware about it, don't they? And it is these open conversations that are everyday conversations, and not just for when someone is, as Kathryn put, so ill that they could die. And I was thinking back, Gina, to a situation that I was in around advanced care planning with somebody whose son was in his 40s, and very similar scenario to yourself. They were told when their son was born that he wouldn't live past the age of 1. And they were basically told that every year of his life that he wouldn't live another 12 months. And he did, and he was in his 40s. But because of that, they wouldn't engage in any conversations, and they wouldn't engage with their son about what mattered to him and what was important to him. So if something either acute had happened, and he'd got also a variety of complex issues, there was nothing in place. There was absolutely nothing in place. And that was because they'd been told from a tiny child that he was going to die within the 12 months, and he kept living. And so they thought he was going to keep living as well. So I think, for them, being able to sit and really chat with somebody about what was important, what matters, who matters, and, for decisions, best interest decisions, I think that really helped them. And they did actually manage then to put some things down. So in the event of something happening, there were things put in place. But particularly, the idea about the training for family members, I think that's really important.
Thanks, Gemma. And it just makes me realise how much more there is to discuss about this. The many examples we have of medical staff underestimating the ability of people with a learning disability to survive something that we think they wouldn't survive, or to cope with treatments they think they couldn't cope with. It's really important to know that, and to know people's resilience and strengths, that it isn't just weaknesses. But thank you.
Can I just say, locally, it's about transparency, about what their procedures are in each locality, and making people aware of what is the procedures for all this kind of thing. I think it's really important that locally people should be approaching like parent carer forums, hospices, and sharing what the procedure would be as well. Yeah. So I just think it's really important. Training all the way. for everybody.
I just wanted to say that with regard to training, certainly parents and families need to know, and people with learning disabilities need to know about this, and training is important. But for me, equally, if not more important, is training for professionals. And I would like to see events like this for professionals to try and explain and remind them what good practice looks like. And if we do that, we're going to make a lot of change and improve the lives of a lot of people.
Yeah. Thanks very much. I couldn't agree more, Ian. And it is so, I mean, it is partly why it is so important to have people like yourselves coming to, to speak like this and to share your experiences and examples, because that is the training we need, is listening to your experiences and examples. It's so thank you for joining us in that, all of you. And Maureen as well, actually, you telling the story of your the people that you've worked with. Yeah.
And Ian, if you get issues that come up, pass them to Irene, and she can pass them to the rest of us, and we can discuss them. You don't have to put details, and you can make them anonymous. But if there are particularly sticky issues, we do come across clinicians who struggle for one reason or another. Sometimes they're just plain obstructive. Sometimes they just haven't understood. Sometimes they haven't thought of other solutions. And sometimes you need some help, to help them to think of other ways of doing this, Sometimes they need a rap on the knuckles, but, a lot of times they just need a solution, and they just haven't seen the solution. They haven't realized it's there. So, contact Irene, and then she can pass it on to us, and we're happy to help.
Yeah, I pick that up and say, just remind us all that nothing succeeds like success. And if you've got examples of where it's happened well, let's give people things to aspire to. Let's see the sorts of conversations that helped, the sorts of forms of words that were useful, the sort of plans that in the end became the turning point for something to go in a good way instead of in a bad way. Because I think we've got to share really good practice to show people what really good practice looks like. And, I really, really appreciate the wisdom we've had, particularly from Ian and Gina today, because until somebody stands up and says, this is about my family and it's not working, I think people just keep on. And it's fantastic to have your help. Thank you.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think you're right. It is really important to hear. And that's why the leader inquiry and your engagement with that, Ian, is so important. And waving the flag saying, look, this is what's gone wrong. But you're right, Kathryn, we also really need to hear what has gone right. I think the more we can raise awareness and share those experiences and wisdom, the better. So I just want to say thank you very much to our panel. It's Kathryn Mannix, Claud Regnard and Ilora Finlay, and Maureen is a half panel, half questioner, but also in particular to our audience, to our questioners, Gina Walker and Ian Penfold. And to Gemma Allen, the chair of our web network, for supporting this as well. And thank you from me, Irene Tuffrey-Wijne. I hope this was useful, and please keep these conversations going. I realise now that even this 1 hour of Q&A still wasn't enough, but it is a start, and we really need to keep talking about this. So thank you very much indeed.
Great.
There, how's my Fiona Bruce impersonation, folks?
Very good.
So,
can I just say thank you for inviting me, because actually when I left the last webinar, I was absolutely horrified and furious when I came off. So I'm glad I've got to ask my questions to the panel. I don't know if Ian felt the same,
Absolutely.
but I spoke to some of the other people who was on that webinar. Oh, I didn't know there was on the webinar until I saw the names on the participants, and there was messaging me during the webinar saying, what the heck? I think we've had a chance to go more in depth into it, and I think having us on, just like I've said, from a parent carer's perspective, it's been invaluable for me. I feel a lot more calm coming off this time than I did last time.
yeah. And Gina, that is so important to hear. And can you say a little bit more what was so infuriating? Because that's important for us to know how it leaves the attendees. And
to be honest, I think what it was there wasn't time for questions and answers properly. So a lot of people was putting, I put quite a few comments in the chat, And I think it's sort of like, it sounded like they was dodging the bullet. They didn't want to answer the questions. So it was it felt like avoidance. It wasn't, obviously, you had a time limit, but the parent carers I spoke to, it felt like he was avoiding them questions.
Yeah.
Because we wouldn't like the answers as parent carers and the family members. And I think that's what I took away from it, that it felt like avoidance. And I thought twice about accepting the invitation today, and then I thought, no, I'll go and have a mess there. But I feel a lot better today coming away than I did last time. I just wanted to tell you guys that.
Sorry, if it's any help, Gina, we went through all the questions, every single one. There were about 300, but we distilled them down.
Got them here on a piece of paper.
we actually took them all out and looked at them to see what the issues were, because we could see there were a lot of questions, and actually that's what precipitated this. And I still think there is an argument in answering some of those questions online formally, if you like, because it shows that we actually did listen to those questions, read them, and go through them, because they're all very important. And unless people like Gina and Ian tell us these things, otherwise it can feel very frustrating. And it may be something for the future that we actually need to have more question and answer. Maybe half of it needs to be question and answer. That may be something that's worth bearing in mind.
Can I just say, Claude, I think that should be on the recording.
Yeah.
For the people that watch the webinar, that you've actually went through those questions, I think it's really important that parents and family members hear that.
It is really important to hear. It's always a difficult thing to weigh up, and of course, because of the formats and the platform for these webinars, we cannot have live questionnaires. The attendees, it's not possible to have them live. We have looked into it in depth, and because of this huge volume of numbers, to have a webinar where you can have attendees live, there's often a limit of 300 attendees, and we get thousands. So we don't want to exclude them, but it may well be that this kind of thing for some topics like this, is an option, that we pick those up afterwards. But you're right. I mean, we are concerned for topics like this, particularly if there's families and people with real, the real experience there, that we can't do it justice. And that was a concern. And then we talked about that a lot.
Yeah, we actually talked about it in bits between the live event, because we could see the volume of parent carers that had attended this particular webinar. And just to sort of give you a bit of an idea what happens behind the scenes, Irene is presenting, and we have somebody from Kingston University that deals with the tech things, if you like. Myself, that tends to be managing the Twitter account so that we live tweet it as well. And then there's normally one person that monitors the Q&A who volunteers to do that. So when people will put things in the Q&A and they want links, it's very easy for us to just quickly put out those links. However, we're not able to respond to every comment and question, and that person wouldn't be fully comfortable or be able to give you the answers that you need. But like Irene and Claude said, we could see the volume of questions and comments that were pinging through. So we downloaded that dialogue, and actually I think by 11 o'clock on the evening, Claude had put it together into themes, so that was all there, and that was where we said we need to do something extra.
It took a couple of hours.
Yeah.
It took a couple of hours to go through all the questions.
Yeah.
So, there wouldn't have been time in a question and answer session, and it would be nice to be able to pick out some individual ones. And I know Irene was trying to pick out some. But as I say, it took me 2 hours to put them together and to look through all the themes. And it turned out there were a set of common themes, much of the ones we've discussed today, in fact.
And that's why I asked you to, particularly Ian, because I think I picked up one of your questions. I have a little bit of time, because some of the webinars pre-recorded, during which time, when the people are speaking, I can quickly see all these questions coming in. Huge volumes. You haven't got time to read them all, because it's all, you've got to be on cue and back there. But I think I asked one of your questions and I could see that we didn't have time, and I thought, actually, I wish Ian was here, because I'm sure he'd have something to say about the answer, and more to explain about why. And that's why I think this, I really wanted to hear from you, because I think the people asking the most sort of challenging and questions are the most important for these webinars.
I'm very grateful. Irene. Yeah, I'm a born troublemaker at the best of times, so please forgive me. But I empathise with Gina. I felt very frustrated too that there wasn't time for questions and answers. But fair enough. Obviously, there was a time limit. But it's important because as families we get used to being lectured at.
Yeah.
And if we don't have a chance for dialogue, we feel very much like we're being pat on the head and having it explained in simple terms because we don't understand, when actually we're the blinking lived experts and we do know all about it, and all we want is for people to understand.
And does it feel different today, Ian, or are you still going away with some things that you want better unwrapped?
Oh no, I'm very much calmer today, having had this, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. One of my other roles is as an expert by experience with the NHS Care and Treatment Review Programme. So I've talked to hundreds of families with young people and adult sons and daughters who struggle with mental health, with physical disabilities, with all sorts of things. And in the main, one of the biggest problems is that people don't listen to them. That is where the frustration comes from. And I think this is a great opportunity to be listened to. So thank you all very, very much.
Yeah.
It's a team effort.
And it has to be. It has to be. I think so. Thank you very much indeed. And I shall have to end this meeting now. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much all. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all.